future is not yours to choose.
Welcome to Voices of Resistance. You are listening to WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
The viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or the staff.
I'm Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
Co-hosts of today's show. Voices of Resistance is a project of the Savannah Justice and Peace Collective. We give voice to resistors who have no voice in mainstream media and present a wide range of issues that affect us all.
But there will always be resistance. The next battle will always be near. As long as you have everything, there will be those who have nothing to fear. And little by little, or maybe all at once, you will lose. Because our future is not yours to choose.
She does. Welcome to Voices of Resistance. This is Barbara Humphrey.
And I'm Albert Strickland.
I'm Phoenix Godwin.
And we have Savannah Patterson at the controls.
Powerful crew today. Today's show was planned on the anniversary of the Attica Prison Uprising on September 13th, 1971. The importance of that uprising was that the leaders went beyond protesting prison conditions to actually questioning the need for prisons. We didn't do the show on September 13th because of the impending hurricane, but we're here today to talk about prisons. Are they obsolete? Should they be abolished? Can they be abolished? But first, we're going to talk about something that's been in the news and more recently in the news.
Actually, it's something that's really important to me, and it's the Take a Knee. I'd call it a movement. Where people are actually beginning to understand what's happening in this country. And it all started with a quarterback in the NFL for the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick. And it didn't start the way most of us think. He did not start by kneeling. He started by sitting. That's all he did was sit for the first 3 games. It wasn't until the 3rd game that a reporter noticed him and took a picture of it. And after that, he talked to some teammates. One teammate, Eric, joined him, and they took the knee. And then they had another one. But his statement was why he did this. We were a little confused. Everyone tends to think this is his protest to flag, anthem, and that sort of thing. And for a lot of us, it may well be. But his was a little more specific. And this was his reasoning. This was his quote. "I am not going to stand up to show pride in a flag for a country that oppresses black people and people of color," he said. "To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder." Now, this was some 14 months ago that this began, and to this day, he's still out of a job, but he stood, one person stood, and now people are standing, and it's involved now a war between the NFL and the president and President Trump.
Or not standing, rather.
Or not standing, yes. That's the whole point, I guess. A lot of us have wanted to do this for a long time because we all have reasons, as this one is for the black people and people of color. We all support this 100%. And we have our own, like I have opposition to the wars that we're involved in and all the drones and the murders and the killings that we're doing and the terrific amount of waste of life and money. So for me, it is, yes, supporting Kaepernick and those who stand for that, and also supporting, trying to make the country stand up for something. It stand up for something as we kneel, and
Right.
that's not happening yet. So
And
that's my impression.
One of the reasons that we're talking about it today is that over the weekend we saw the truth being distorted. And we try so hard to get past the distortions, the propaganda, to the truth. So what we started reading was that this protest was against our current president, against this current administration, And we felt it was important to bring us back to what this protest is really about. And we thank Jim Maracas,
Yes, Connect Savannah.
Connect Savannah, for helping to bring it back to its focus.
In fact, he in the last week's edition of Connect Savannah, he said the main thing that really jumps out across the spectrum of opinion is how few people on either side of the debate this past weekend even mentioned the original purpose of kneeling for the national anthem. And then we discovered just before we came here later today an article in Business Insider that also brought out all the issues. So.
And what this protest is really about.
You should get a little space between you and the mic, just a little bit.
All right, so go ahead.
Little mic difficulty here. Okay, are we all right now? Okay.
Okay.
So now we have a show.
Yes, now we go back to the show that we originally planned for September 13th. Are prisons obsolete? Should they be abolished? And can they be abolished? And we would like to start with a quote from Angela Davis, who actually inspired us on this path.
Yeah, quote from Angela Davis. Prison relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of our society, especially those produced by racism and, increasingly, global capitalism.
Right. So basically what she's saying is, instead of dealing with the problems that cause people to commit crimes, to behave in ways that we as a society have defined as unacceptable, we just throw them in a cage and out of sight, out of mind, instead of dealing with the problems. So we start with the first question: are prisons obsolete? And as we started looking at that, the first thing that came to us was that prisons really serve no purpose and make the problems worse. Initially, they were designed to make us safe by taking people who committed crimes off the street and to rehabilitate them so that they would come back into society. But there is no documentation that prisons actually rehabilitate people.
In fact, the opposite is true.
Right, they seem to make it worse. After somebody's been in prison, they have a difficulty getting employment and housing. So if you have somebody you've imprisoned for what is called a crime of need, they've stolen something because they can't afford to obtain it any other way, certainly once they've gotten out of prison, they're less able to get a job and to be able to provide themselves with the necessities of life. Former prisoners are separated from their families, and that's a loss not just to them but to their families, and also a loss to their communities where they may have been productive members. They participated in the social life, the economy of the community, and they're not there. Usually in prison, we will see that their human and civil rights are being violated. When they come out, they can't vote. They, for many crimes, cannot return or live in public housing. And there are many other things that prisoners are unable to do.
Although in some states, Georgia in one, they can vote. Florida, of course, they can't. But in Georgia, you can vote.
Right. And in some states,
and a lot of
there's
people
just a
don't
process.
know that, but
right.
they should.
There's a process of reinstating your right to vote, but if people don't know it and they don't go through it. And then there's also corruption within the prison itself. We know the irony is that people who've been convicted of drug crimes, there's often more drugs inside the prison than out. And there are some other issues. The war on drugs with its harsh sentencing guidelines increased the people of color in prison, while laws like Stand Your Ground keep the guilty, the people who've murdered somebody, out of prison. And the jail and prison building boom is not helpful. It does not enhance cities where jails are being built to look like skyscrapers, and it certainly doesn't add anything to a countryside that's marred by the construction of a prison.
Part of it also is that the people that are targeted for prison, and it is a targeting, are minority neighborhoods through such things as the broken window policing, stop and frisk, and all these things where they target specific people, usually, as Kaepernick pointed out too, black and
People of color.
color. Yeah,
Right.
people of color. They're the primary because they're easy targets.
Yep. We also discovered that prisons have become the home for people with mental illness. In fact, there are more mentally ill people in prison than in facilities serving the mentally ill.
Not that those places are much better off normally, also.
Right,
No,
but
that's
certainly perhaps slightly better off than prison. And criminal justice response to persons with mental illness is often inappropriate and leads to either shooting or death of that person. So how did we get here? We did a little research into the history of prisons and discovered that, pre-Revolutionary War, there really were no such things as prisons. You did an act that was considered inappropriate, illegal, and the punishment was corporal, was capital.
Well-
You were held in a jail before your adjudication, but you were not sentenced to prison.
Well, they did have imprisonment, but it would not be like, this is your term and then you're done. Like, there'd be debtors' prisons that people would go to and they would just be there. And that's where you are now. You're in prison. And that's one of the things Oglethorpe was trying to reform before he founded Savannah, actually.
Right,
that was primarily
those in
European.
Europe, not here, not in this
No,
country.
no, not here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Here we
So-
had stockades and
Well, here
things
we
like
had
that, or
stockades
stocks.
and
They put you in
Pillars,
stocks.
yes, people were put in stocks. Sometimes they were exiled, because at that time, if you were exiled and you couldn't survive in the wilderness on your own, you could be in a lot of trouble. So that was how the country dealt with people who they considered in need of removal from society or in need of some kind of punishment.
Well, part of the things that really prompted us to look at this is that we think of the United States as this benevolent, wonderful, free people country, and the world is supposed to aspire to being as we are. And yet here we are. We're only 5% of the world's population. Just 5%. And yet, how many prisoners do we possess in the world?
We have 25% of the world's prison population.
That's
That's
right,
right.
5% of the world's population, but yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. That we like to point to Russia and China and all these other evil countries, and we have more than almost any civilized country in the earth.
Right. So in just a little more than 200 years, we went from no prisoners to having 2.3 million people in federal and state and local penal institutions.
And 7 million under correctional supervision,
That's right.
which now they have to pay for themselves. So you get out, you can't get a job, but you're supposed to pay for the supervision, and if you don't pay, you go back to jail.
Right.
Yeah. So how did we go from 0 to 2.3 million, and what were the causes of this growth? So we start with the early founding of the country, when, in addition to there being a population boom, there was also a need for, which created overcrowding, which led to, as prisons grew, they experimented with treatment under the idea that prisoners' behaviors could be reformed through confinement and labor.
Right. So how we got from not having prisons to having prisons was people that were saying, people trying to be charitable in a sense at the time, misguidedly trying to
Yep.
come up with something better and reform their punishment system into something where people could be penitent.
Right.
Well, the whole point was primarily to rehabilitate people. And now it seems as though we've gone to this revenge thing. This, revenge is not the best word, but this
Oh, a lot of times it
punishment.
is.
Punishment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to punish you for having done it. It's not to help you change your life in any way or be a more productive person within the society in which you live, but it's to take everything away from you, which further inhibits the process.
And but this wasn't. I don't even think that this was necessarily meant to be the end all be all solution either. This was a
No.
step forward in how are we going to deal with prison, the people that we deem unfit for our society right now, and here's a solution, and then we just stopped. And we,
Right.
we didn't keep going.
Let's stop executing. Let's stop putting them in the stockades. Let's do something more humane. Put them in a cell.
And once we realized that was inhumane, we just kept doing it.
Well, and once we put them in the cell, we experimented with different ways of making that cell less and less humane. We experimented with enforced silence and hard labor, and solitary confinement. Very early in the 1800s, those were two things that were added to the prison experience.
You know, the punishment series, I grew up in the 50s and the early 60s, and some of the programs we used to watch, especially the Westerns, they had this punishment called a sweat box. It was a metal box, and usually out in the Southwest in the hot desert sun, and they would put you in this sweat box where you would actually bake. Temperatures could be well over 100, 120 degrees inside there, and that was their punishment if you didn't do what and it could be any infraction, small things, into the sweat box. Well, that certainly helps you rehabilitate who you are, right?
Sure does.
There's also the panopticon.
Yeah, that's a new thing. Yeah, the panopticon I like to refer to as our society today. We're panopticon.
Yeah.
A panopticon is basically a system where you can be watched 24 hours a day, but you can't see anything else.
Well, more specifically, it's that one of the really important parts about the panopticon's design is that the lighting is so that the warden, the overseer, can be looking in any direction in 360 degrees, and no matter where you're in the prison, you feel like you're being surveyed by the warden.
It's kind of like walking down the street with all the cameras and things we have now.
Or driving and, you know, not knowing if you're being watched or not.
So practicing Big Brotherism before it was ever a concept.
Well, that's where they actually perfected it, I guess, in one way or another, you could say.
And surely we wouldn't all be surprised to know that after the Civil War, the prison system grew exponentially. First of all, we had all these emancipated slaves, and they could no longer be forced to work because slavery had been abolished, but we could find ways to charge them and convict them of whatever crimes were determined to be crimes against society.
But wait a minute. We have this thing called the 13th Amendment that
That's
ended
right.
slavery, right?
Did it? It abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. So you've got all of these emancipated slaves who might actually want to look for jobs and displace others, but now you've got the prison system who can suck them up, and they can be sentenced to hard labor, the chain gangs. And then there was also the system called convict lease system, where you could lease prisoners to corporations. Does it sound like slavery?
Well, I grew up seeing these chain gangs along the side of the road, you know, the black-white stripes on the buses and the guards with their shotguns and all patrolling up and down and, you know, just doing menial tasks.
Yeah.
If you look at if you look at that part of history, it was almost a complete, like you said, we found out like, okay, we can't have slaves anymore, but then a bunch of people scratched their chins and said, oh, but can't we please? Yes. And so like immediately a lot of these same plantations that were just operating off of slave labor are again operating off of slave labor. It's just that now they're excusing it by saying it's prisoners.
Right.
I know I'm jumping ahead on some of this, but that's exactly what prisons are now. They are plantations. Texas, for instance, we discovered during this thing, actually can force, well, they say they don't force you, but they punish you if you don't participate into working, and you get no pay whatsoever. You get maybe some little benefit like an extra ice cream or something. You
also,
know,
Arkansas, I think, does that also.
Yeah, and so do a lot of other states. Now, they can pay as little as 2 cents to 22 cents an hour, something like that.
Absurdity. And then, of course, charging you how much for a phone call?
That's right. And that's working up to 12 hours a day.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
so
that's
it's, in fact, slave labor. And in a little bit, we're going to talk about the companies today that actually use prison labor to produce products that we spend an awful lot of money for.
And to prove that it is a continuation of the plantation idea, 37% of the total population is people of color.
That's right.
Prison population.
Prison population, yes. 60% of the prison population, 37% of the U.S. population, people of color, but 60% of the prison population.
That's right. And to give you a sense of how the prison population grew, well, obviously, when the country was founded, we started with 0. In 1925, there were 91,000 prisoners, and in 2016, 2.3 million. So that was quite a jump. And as we just heard, The majority of those who are incarcerated are people of color, are black people.
60%.
And certainly we know from observation, from anecdotal information, that they are poor, because one of the reasons people wind up in prison is that they can't afford a legal defense. They're encouraged to plea bargain, and even if they're encouraged to plea bargain, so their sentence will be lower. But then when they get in front of the judge certainly has the discretion of totally ignoring whatever was agreed to and sentencing people.
There's also the mental health problem
Yes.
we talked about earlier.
Yes, definitely.
Another way of filling the prisons. There's also the fact that in a court of law, you no longer need hardcore evidence to prove someone. Most of the convictions are actually done on just circumstantial evidence.
That's
I
right.
know you were there, so you did it, which is not necessarily
Right.
true,
Right.
but we know people who fall into that category.
And we certainly have read stories, we have read news articles about people who identified somebody as being the perpetrator of a crime, and then coming up weeks later, years later, saying,
Sometimes
no,
decades later.
Some as many
Decades
as
later.
45
That's right.
years they've spent in prison for a
That's right.
crime they did not commit. And this is not
absolutely.
an exception to the rule. This happens quite a bit.
Yes, it absolutely happens quite a bit.
We've also, so we're talking about the population jump into prisons, and I think it's really, really worth noting that for starting at 1925, when we've got almost 100,000 prisoners, we also have the fluctuation that goes on in that period between decades. It's never really more than 100,000 change. It actually goes back down at one point, but once we hit 1980,
Oh, what happened in
Oh,
1980?
1980.
all of a sudden in 1980, we more than double our amount of prisoners in the next 10 years. This is
That's
a
right.
fluctuation unlike anything that has happened before then.
That's right.
Who was
That's
president
exactly
then?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
I wasn't around back then.
Oh, God.
No, I know, but it was Ronald Reagan.
Right.
Yeah,
It was Ronald
so-
Reagan. And then you look at the decade from, you go to, from 1980 to 1990, and then another huge jump from 1990 to 2000 when Bill Clinton was president.
We basically started the exponential rise
Yes,
of prisoners
right.
once,
That's right.
once Reagan
That's
came
But
right.
what was one of the central factors that did that?
Well,
it
there
wasn't just him being president. What
No.
happened to cause that?
There were a couple of things that happened. First of all, the country was being deindustrialized. Our factories were closing, our production was going offshore, which left an awful lot of people without jobs. And this human surplus is the term that we heard, which is a horrible term.
And then there was this
and then
war
there
that
was
started.
this war. It started under Richard Nixon and then really, really grew under Presidents Reagan and Clinton, the war on drugs. And currently, a quarter of our prison population are people who are there on a drug conviction. And it's just a process where police are promoted for the number of arrests. And boy, it's easy to just hit a neighborhood, stop and frisk, and find drugs. And it's an easy way to get your arrest numbers up, and it's an easy way to take people, particularly poor people of color, off the streets and into the prisons.
Then they also have this thing that actually gives money to the state.
Yes.
What is this forfeiture?
Asset
Asset
forfeiture.
Oh,
forfeiture.
that's
Yes.
a whole other thing.
You can be just accused of a crime. You don't have to be convicted or
Right.
anything, just accused, and you can lose your house, your car, your votes, and boats, or anything else you've got, all your property, and the chances of getting it back are almost nil,
That's right.
even if you're proven innocent.
There,
Right.
you could do a whole show on
just
asset
on asset
forfeiture. That
forfeiture.
is
Yes.
a huge thing.
Well, in fact, in 2 weeks, we are going to do a whole show on the war on drugs. And between then and now, I hope to be going to a drug policy reform conference and bringing back enormous amount of information, including asset forfeiture. The irony, of course, some of you may be listening thinking, well, we need to get those drugs off the street. We need to, there's just too many drugs on the street. I was in a conversation with a former judge and who had also been a district attorney who said, drug busts create job opportunities. Every time you take a dealer off the street, you open up a corner for someone else. And these street corners aren't won by filing a business certificate. They're not won by getting a right to a corner. They're won through violence, through guns and violence. So the war on drugs, taking dealers off the street, does not make us safer. You know, the other thing that added to the increased prison population was the criminalization of behaviors, this tough on crime. And then once you were convicted, we had mandatory minimum sentencing, we had guideline-based sentencing, which basically took discretion for sentencing away from judges. You could no longer stand before a judge and say, you know, Judge, he's really a good kid. He's not done anything else. Let's give him a break. You couldn't do that anymore because you had these requirements for this crime, particularly drug crimes. This is the sentence. And as many of us know from California, there was this thing called 3 strikes and you're out. So you could be caught go walking down the street with a bag of marijuana in your pocket 3 times, and you would be in prison for life.
Well, you mentioned the criminalization of behavior, and that's an important factor. And to me, it is one that is ever expanding.
Yep.
Things that wouldn't even be considered a crime not long ago now at once are. And one of the first things that strikes out to me is our expression of our First Amendment rights.
That's right.
Speech, the ability to freely assemble, to redress government of offenses, to express our opinions openly and freely is being curtailed. And people who do that, or even according to an FBI training manual at one time, was that anyone who dissents from the government or protest is a low-level terrorist. And we all know that that's not true, but it seems as though that we're just sitting silently watching this ever expand until someday you protest and you're arrested, period. And sometimes now with the
CMUs, are you getting into that?
Yeah.
Are you trying to get into the CMUs?
The NDAA, and yes, that leads to the CMUs. We'll get into that in a minute too. The CMUs are very important. We just learned about those too.
Right, and sometimes it's simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Or the right place at the wrong time.
Or the right place at the wrong time, and you're kettled with others, and we certainly know about that in this room, don't we?
Mm. I'm not supposed to say much according to my lawyer right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll let that go.
We can do
we'll
the
let
talking.
that go. Yeah.
We can do the talking.
There will be a day when you will be free to speak.
Yeah. And, you know, we also know, we've heard the term on the street, driving while black, walking while black. People who are just picked up because, what are you doing in this neighborhood? Why are you here? And
well, Barbara and I one day, we live in an area of
Yes.
town that is not exactly considered a ritzy part of town.
No.
In fact, it's considered the opposite of that. People
a
don't
great
want to
part
come
of
into
town.
our neighborhood because they say, oh, that's a bad area. It's not a bad area. It's a great area. I
Yep.
love it.
I do too.
We were walking home one night, 9:30 at night,
Yeah.
and this cop pulls over and asks us where we're going.
Right.
Like it's any of his business. We're on a sidewalk. We're walking in an area. We're not bothering anyone. We're the only people on the street.
That's right. 2 old people walking down the street.
2 old people walking down the street. He wants to know where we're going.
Well, that's okay. So, but the thing about that is that a lot of people, and that's where the walking while black thing comes from, is that when you are confronted by a police person, a lot of times if you don't go along with what they're doing, or you don't interact with them in the way that you want to, then they will go ahead and either rough you up or put charges on you, or both. And it's like that's the absurdity of the walking while
Right.
black.
Or even if you do
Yeah,
everything
I guess
right.
we are lucky that we are older. And
You know, a couple
Yeah.
older
Different
white
color,
folks,
yeah.
it makes
That's
it
right.
easier
That's
for
right.
you.
That's right.
But he did bother us,
Our
which
privilege.
surprised me. I was shocked.
Right.
Yeah. And afterwards, we thought about different things to say, but then we realized it was better we just smiled
just
and
said-
walked on.
To be fair, y'all are up to no good.
There you go. He said where we're going. I said
Shh,
home and
don't-
continued walking. He didn't say another word to him, and he didn't follow us or do anything. Now, if I'd been black, I am sure I'd have been in trouble.
That's right.
We're convinced of that because we know people who have done less and they're in trouble.
Right.
Okay. Well, it's time to identify our station. We are WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul.
This portion of WRUU-LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
If your business enjoys our programming on WRUULP, please support the station with a donation. Let your customers, neighbors, and friends know that you share our vision of building a thriving community based on diverse, vibrant radio programming. As a business partner, our listeners will know you support Savannah's only broad-based community radio station. Become a tower sponsor or underwriter. To check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Again, to check out the levels of corporate sponsorship and to donate, go to www.wruu.org/business. Thank you for listening to and supporting WRUULP.
The Savannah Bicycle Campaign 9th Annual Midnight Garden Ride will be held October 21st at 7 p.m. The nighttime bike ride is followed by a concert at Grayson Stadium and is the largest annual fundraiser for the nonprofit bicycle advocacy organization. More information and registration is available at midnightgardenride.com.
So thank you for staying with us during our identification. We will identify ourselves now. I'm Barbara Humphrey.
I'm Albert Strickland.
And I'm Phoenix Godwin.
And I'm Savannah.
Yay!
Hi, Savannah.
Savannah.
Thank you so much for listening to Voices of Resistance. We are discussing today whether or not prisons should be abolished, and if so, how we can abolish them. We were talking a little bit about political dissent, and it's amazing how many individuals are in prison right now for activities that, for speaking out against the government, for acting out against the government, for expressing their First Amendment rights. And this goes back into history, names that many of us are familiar with: Emma Goldman, Eugene V. Debs, members of the Black Panther Party such as H. Rap Brown, Assata Shakur, Angela Davis.
Leonard Peltier.
Yes.
Mamiya Abu-Jamal. Jeffrey Sterling. Red Fawn Fallis, which is from Standing Rock.
A-Trap Brown goes by
yes.
He's
now
Imam Jamil now.
Yes, yes.
And of course Chelsea Manning.
And Chelsea Manning, who has been pardoned, but certainly we were hopeful that there would have been many other pardons as well.
Yeah, she can't go to Canada.
So that's right, she can't go to Canada. But when we think about the idea of political prisoners, it seems so antithetical to who we are as a country, or at least what we were brought up thinking who we were as a country. And not only do we put people who are political dissenters in prison, but we also have created these secret prisons. We call them, where we house second-tier terrorists.
Oh, you mean that's first tier, though, the one in Cuba, right? We have
yes,
that one.
One in Cuba, Guantanamo.
Yeah, which was supposed to be closed, remember?
I remember. Was it closed?
Kind of like how slavery was supposed to be ended.
That's right. Well, maybe the wrong people are in Guantanamo.
That's right.
A fair point.
That's a very fair point. But we did discover these two secret prisons. They're called Communication Management Units, CMUs. And we have one in Terre Haute, Indiana, and we have another one in Illinois. I can't remember the city there. And at this point, when most of the people that we identify as terrorists are Muslims, there are 60 to 70 prisoners who are mostly Muslim, and all have been convicted of crimes. But as I know from one of the people in there who I actually am very familiar with, who was convicted of, he was collecting money, help the needy, to get to people in Iraq. And he was accused of sending money to terrorists.
Yes, he is a doctor, and he was sending medical supplies when we had imposed these sanctions against Iran, which Iraq. I mean, in which children were dying because of the lack of medical care. So he was just sending medical aid. That's it, nothing else. But you can't help children.
No, you can't help the needy, and you certainly can't help children. So the other people who are sentenced to these CMUs are called balancers. They balance out the Muslim population in prison, and they're mostly environmental activists. And a new name was used.
Here, 1 second, folks. Sorry, having a little technical.
Just a little.
There was a new name that's been coined to deal with these environmental activists. They're called eco-terrorists. And so there we have our CMUs. The imprisoning is much harsher than it is in other prisons. There are no contact visits. Visitation is very limited. And while there's no physical torture, the prisoners will tell you they're psychologically tortured.
There is such a severe restriction of their rights. For instance, where someone like the bomber in Atlanta can get 300 minutes of airtime or something, these are allowed.
It's phone call time that they're allowed to have.
Is it phone time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's something like that.
And
But
letters were once a month, of six pages or something, and it was just a mess what they could do compared to others who are mass murderers or.
right, the so-called eco-terrorists are allowed way less time to interact with anybody outside of them, outside of themselves, outside of the prison. Compared to even the person who tried to bomb the Olympic Stadium.
Right. If you're an animal rights activist or an Earth First tree hugger, you could be in real trouble.
Now, the reason that they gave for this is they said that they had, what was it, inspirational influence or something like that?
Right, because these people had influence because of the way they spoke.
Essentially, they were anti-government and
Right.
anti-corporate, and that was something that's not allowed. And
That's the real crime.
right.
And these prisoners are there. This is such a violation of our Constitution. And you have to say, why is it happening? And for the most part, it's happening because people just don't know about these facilities. And even when they do know, they're not necessarily motivated to act. These are people who are out of sight, out of mind, in places that we're not even aware of.
Did you mention that they're called balancers? These.
Yes, the balancers, the eco-terrorists.
Right. Yeah.
Well, they're to balance out the.
They balance out the
Muslims.
Right.
Yes.
Since they have this hugely Muslim population, then they get these political prisoners of the white political prisoners to
Right.
be able to balance it out.
Yep.
And say that it's not disproportionate, even though it totally
Right.
is.
Even
Has
though
to
it totally
avoid the
is.
lawsuits that would happen
Yes.
if they were all
Yes.
Muslim. Yes.
So another enormous feeder of the prison system are our schools, our public schools. It's horrifying to imagine that, but there is a direct relationship between the discipline that's going on in schools right now and future imprisonment. In fact, I was listening to One Human Nation last Thursday, and Sandy mentioned that they are
And that's
actually...
here on WRUU,
That's here on
just in case.
WRUU. And she mentioned that they determine the number of prison cells they're going to need by the reading levels of third graders. So basically, kids are being harshly disciplined with police and schools. They're often suspended. Because of these suspensions or expulsions, they're not in the classroom learning. They will very likely drop out and not graduate. And most of the individuals in prison today do not have a high school diploma. So this is called the school to prison pipeline. And I don't know if all of you were in school when there were police. Phoenix, did you have police in your schools?
We didn't have police in my schools other than the DARE program. I know that there are police in schools, but I will say that I do notice, even though I had like a fairly progressive school, a lot of the public education system is not that different from being in prison in a lot of ways. Structurally, it's the same. They put you in a line. They walk you from one place to the next. They discipline you heavily over whatever it is.
Right.
Like it's very. What was the word that you used earlier? You said like this cultural control that you were describing earlier, and I feel like that happens a lot. It's very prevalent in the school
schools.
system.
That's right.
In order to learn, you have to have children automatically have an inquisitive nature. They ask 300 to 400 questions a day. I know because it's annoying sometimes, but they do.
Can be.
And it's because that's how they learn, is by asking questions. So what do we do when we send them to school? Shut up, sit down, only do what I tell you to do, raise your hand if you have to go potty, and walk on the right side in a line, and don't speak, don't talk, don't do all this stuff. And that was when I was growing up. I don't know about now.
Right.
So,
and now there are thousands of police officers in the schools. In fact, there are states that give money to schools in order to hire, they're often called community service officers.
But to be fair, though, I had police at our schools, too. It was usually on career day, once a year.
Career day.
That was it.
Oh, my goodness.
That doesn't count, Albert.
I know.
That doesn't count. You're right. In 1997, there were law enforcement officers in 10% of our public schools. That rose to 30% in 2014, and I would dare say it may be even higher than that. When my kids were in school, there were definitely police in the schools. In fact, right at the door when you came in, you had to sign in, and it was a very controlling situation. So there's also a federal program called COPS that was that came into being in the mid-1990s. That has provided almost $900 million in grants to schools to hire resource officers. And this is shocking to me. There are actually 5 states where a school district can have its own school district-run police agency. So in California, for example, if let's say you're the Los Angeles United School District, you can actually have your own police department. And that just seems horrifying to me.
If you've looked at these buildings, I went to Savannah High when it was on Washington Avenue, and then they built this new school over there. When I first saw it, I thought I was looking at a prison. It's high fenced all around. It's set way back in the background out there, and these new schools have virtually no windows hardly, or they do have windows, but they look like prison windows. These are not the regular school rooms I remember. So they actually don't just mirror prisons in their control, they also mirrors in their appearance,
right?
To me.
They look like prisons. The students inside are treated like prisoners, and the police officers intervene in school discipline. In fact, we found a quote from a parent that says whenever a child does the littlest thing, they're quick to throw the police on them. And
the 10-year-old that was handcuffed.
Yeah.
Just for a scuffle on the school grounds.
That's not just once either. This is a regular thing we're seeing more and more in the news. And also, I think that it's worth pointing out also, like, as well as like having the strong security that they have, and like incredibly disproportionate police responses sometimes to just small schoolyard things. There's also at this point now, the high security nature of these institutions often has it so that parents can't even like take their children outside of the school during school hours. It's like you have to have already turned in a thing ahead of time, and like all these things that a lot of parents would probably argue kind of curtails their rights as parents, but the school is setting itself up as this essentially like this institution which is enforced by the state that you have to participate in, and you have to do it their way.
That's right.
Or people are going to jail.
And that's called in loco parentis, when the school becomes the parent and you lose your rights to your child. That's right. It's a scary thing. And I doubt it would surprise anybody that the enforcement of these rules is certainly race-based. If you're a black male, you're far more likely to be disciplined for very minor infractions, to be suspended or expelled for those infractions, and to fall behind, to drop out, and to find yourself in that pipeline toward prison. The schools also have these zero-tolerance policies, which are very similar to the mandatory minimum sentencing, where if you swear at a teacher, that suddenly means that you are in for a suspension. And it may be that you didn't swear at a teacher, but it's at the discretion of the school.
Well, you remember not long ago the girl that was pulled forcibly by a policeman in school from her desk. It's been all over the internet and everywhere. That was
Yeah.
yeah.
So the other factor in our society right now, which is fueling the prison system, is our lack of an immigration policy. So we know, and we have known for many years, that we have many undocumented people in this country. They are here for all sorts of reasons. Many came over as children with parents. They never got their citizenship, their papers, and it's too late now for them to do anything about it. And picked up for a minor offense, driving infraction. It could be anything. And the municipalities are now required under federal law, to notify ICE of the names of the people who've been detained. And if it's determined that they may be an undocumented individual, the authorities will come in and pick them up and put them in a detention center to determine their status and whether or not they're subject to deportation.
That's why we really need
yes.
Sanctuary cities. Savannah should be one.
Absolutely.
Where we do not comply with ICE's demand, and that's the way it should be. We should not be giving in to this type of tyranny.
No human should be illegal.
No,
humans
are not illegal.
No, there is no such
If you
thing
want
as
to go to
illegal.
legality, who's more illegal than us?
I know.
Right.
The Native Americans, the indigenous peoples are the only legal people here.
That's right.
Basically.
That's right. So all of these factors leading to an increase in people subject to incarceration. And then we have another monster that's lurking, and this is the prison for profit system. And there's actually 3 different parts to this. So
one of them is immigration, which you just pointed out
right,
quite a bit. So.
Right, absolutely. Because there's money that's appropriated. I think when I had read about it, 34,000 slots are paid for annually, or money appropriated for them. And as long as you have the slots, may as well fill them. But
this is actually Congress's opinion. They want you to fill up these beds.
Congress mandated these 34,000 beds. And, of course, private prisons are going to take advantage of it because it's money.
So now we need to get into that prison for profit system, or as it's been more better known now, the prison industrial complex. And it started out where prisoners would be doing things within the prisons for the state, for the locality, and they were raising livestock and then packaging it for sale. They were raising vegetables that would be canned and sold. In the state I came from, they were building furniture for use in state colleges, universities, office buildings, etc.
Some of the important things, and I know that I did the Neighborhood Leadership Academy for Step Up Savannah, and our focus for our project in this was, of course, the community gardens in Savannah. And one of our team members brought in a person from the Georgia Correctional System, where he promoted the idea that they were prisoners are being taught a good trade when they get out by doing all of this things. But we also learned when we were doing this that it's staggering to me that Texas, which we talked about earlier, prisoners raise and process 14 million pounds of beef, 10 million pounds of pork from livestock, and that includes 10,000 cattle, 20,000 pigs, and 250,000 chickens. They raise 74 million pounds of feed to feed their animals, which they take care of, and they produce 300,000 cases of canned vegetables and enough cotton to clothe themselves and others. And these farms are also in places like Georgia, Arizona, Alabama, Mississippi. There's a whole list of states.
That's
and
right.
You are technically forced to work in agriculture, if that's your thing, but there are also some that have logging, quarrying, and mining.
No.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
We mentioned earlier, before we did the show, like there's a lot of people who they buy items that say made in America, and it makes them feel better because they're contributing towards something. But as it turns out, a lot of times they're spending money that does not actually go towards the economy. It's just going towards slave labor. Right.
It's being produced by slave labor and then being sold.
But we have the 13th Amendment. I said earlier, right? There is no slavery.
But it doesn't cover slavery as punishment for a crime.
Which is why corporations are constantly lobbying for more designations of crime.
So
That's
If
right.
they could get jaywalking as a crime, we all might be growing corn tomorrow morning, you know?
So because this is a means of production, because prisoner labor is a huge means to create lots of products and consumer goods, this is why we have the prison industrial complex,
Right.
as we call it.
Right. And some of our all-American companies are or have used prison labor for products that they sell in their stores.
Now,
Whole-
if you buy anything from these corporations, you are participating in this program.
That's right.
And it's a very diverse group of companies, and there are over 50 of them. We only have a list of a few,
A few.
but we
And
will mention them.
Some of these have changed since.
Well, we
then,
think
but-
they have.
Well, that's true. They also are very good at saying that they're not doing it, and then you find out later
They
that they
are,
still
right.
are.
We'll go down the list. List
There's
some of
Whole
these groups.
Foods, McDonald's, Walmart. I'm sure nobody's surprised by. Victoria's Secret,
But you have to stop at that one.
Walmart.
Victoria's
No, we
Secret.
want- I want to
Oh.
talk about
Yeah,
Victoria's
Victoria's
Secret.
Secret. We learned that Victoria's Secret, the prison that makes many of their garments, actually was paid to take tags off that said "Made in Bangladesh" and replace it with tags that said "Made in America"
Wow.
or "Made in the USA."
That's right. So
That's
those
Victoria's Secret. Remember
That's
that
right.
the next time that you are.
Nintendo's
excited.
on this list, which is disappointing to me.
I know AT&T uses prisoners for their call centers.
What?
I mean, it's just
That's
amazing.
not funny. I just
It's
can't
not.
believe it.
And all of these drug companies that are making such a huge amount of money could afford to pay a decent wage to the people who work there. Eli Lilly, Smith,
International
where are we here?
paper. That's
Glaxo.
Yeah, that's here in Savannah.
Yeah, that's- there's
Yes,
international
it's
paper
international
here.
paper. So it's just
Pepsi, you know,
Pepsi.
Microsoft,
Yeah.
Merck, Mary Kay. The next time you buy Mary Kay, remember that.
Now we've only got about 10 minutes left.
Right.
Should we go into what can we do instead of prisons?
Well, before we do that, let's just real quickly talk about the third part of this prison for profit system,
Mm-hmm.
which is private companies that are now building and operating prisons.
Oh.
And
That sounds horrible.
since 1983, again under the administration of Ronald Reagan, who was rather famous for talking about how the private sector can do it better than government employees for contracting out. So that adds a whole new wrinkle to the private for-profit system, and private companies will tell localities, you need to guarantee us a population of prisoners because that's what it says in our contract. We can't do this without that guarantee. So we see how the for-profit system has gone from prisoners making license plates and growing corn to actually now companies and owning. There's now a company that actually builds and operates prisons. So when we talk about the prison system, there are those who'll say, well, can't we just reform it? And it's a question that I suppose is legitimate to ask. We happen to feel that reform is just not enough. Can the prison system be reformed? We've read about reforms such as, trying to get rid of the death penalty. So in replacement for getting rid of the death penalty, we now have life sentences. Getting rid of corporal punishment back in the post-revolutionary days actually led to the establishment of prisons. So no, there's a sense that reform is not good enough.
But when you have one that's based upon abuse, a system based upon abuse, based upon corruption, built on that, established by
Yes.
that, and continues to operate with that system today, it's a little difficult to reform it. You have to come up with something entirely different.
That's right.
The problem, I think one of the biggest problems with reform when we think about that, we're still thinking, we're stuck in this mindset of prisons as a solution to these problems, whereas there's no one solution to all of the problems which prison is supposed to be a resolution to. And when we're talking about, like, the prison system, as we can see through the statistics, it clearly reinforces it reinforces racism and reinforces the male dominance in our society. If you look at the statistics for the disproportionate amount of people that are arrested, there's clearly gender bias in here, especially when you make it racial. It's like insane. And then basically, I was reading Angela Davis's book that we were talking about a little bit, and
which we encourage everyone to read.
Yeah,
Yes.
Our Prison's Obsolete is a short book, and it's very important. I can't stress enough how much people should totally read this book. You learn a lot about how prisons develop to be where they are and how structurally messed up they are from the very beginning. And one of the things that she said that really stuck with me is that if we want to resolve this, if we want to resolve the issues that are put forth that we try to resolve with prisons and that are clearly not working because we still have all these crimes, then we have to address the problems as a society, make radical changes that will address homophobia, male dominance, racism, class disparity and class distinction, all of the things that keep us separate from each other, and that includes like changing the ends of capital where we have like some people less off than others. Like these are what causes social dysfunction and crime. If we don't get rid of those things, we're always going to have the problems that we say prisons are just good for, even though they're not.
That's right.
The mindset's very important. We watched the Michael Moore movie about where to invade next, and I was very impressed with the prison in Norway. Their concept of what prisons should and should not be. They do not have a death penalty, period. And they have there's no such thing as a life sentence. It's 21 years is the maximum. So I'm sure there are variances here as far as, they make some people, but for the rule, these are the rules. So what happens is they have to concentrate on rehabilitation because they know you're coming back into the community someday.
That's right.
So their idea is to make you understand and work together with people and in a community, and they give them the freedom and the respect as people. We take these people and treat them like they're animals and then expect them to come back into a community where they're no longer can do that. I mean,
That's
it's just,
right.
this recidivism rates and all these sort of things where they just...
If we were to get rid of prisons right now, if they just stopped existing, there would be automatically less people that were supposed to go into them. The amount of people that the prison industrial complex creates, the amount of criminals it creates, is so many that if we just stopped it altogether, there would be less people that we considered criminals.
I know there's some people that will disagree with this, but I think the wrong people are in jail, and if the right people were in jail, Congress might be empty tomorrow. So
That's right. And
it's kind of an important situation here. But to abolish prisons, we need to abolish the feeders for
That's
the
right.
prison system, which are what? We've got them listed here for.
well, we've got capitalism.
Very definitely. The war on drugs. We don't need a war on drugs. It's only created more drugs and more war.
Police in the schools,
Would be a good step.
Political
And-
prisoners.
and our
Political
broken
prison.
immigration system.
Yeah.
If we could abolish those problems, if we could deal with those problems, we would manage to reduce the number of people who need to be taken out of society. And certainly with that much, much, much smaller number, we could figure out a way to deal with people. And there are definitely other strategies that can be
One
used.
of the things it says down here also that we didn't talk about is the fact that many of the people are in prison not because they actually committed a crime, but because they were forced to admit to a crime.
That's right.
Whether they did it or not, because they don't have adequate
Legal counsel.
Legal counsel, number one. They don't have money for bail. They don't have money for anything, and they are threatened. You will sign this or else. And
That's right.
that happens quite often, and especially if you're young and you're Hispanic or black or Native American, more so than if you're white. We know of the white kid that was a multimillionaire. You can't go to jail because he's too rich.
Right. So we are going to have to stop our conversation. We're really not completely finished with it. That's the bad news. But the good news
Wait
is
for the book, though. We're going to do a book.
the next Voices of Resistance shows, we are going to focus on how to abolish prisons by discussing these prison feeder systems: capitalism, war on drugs, the war on truth that criminalizes political dissent, our broken immigration system, and militarization of the police. that all lead to this enormous prison population. So I hope you will stick with us as we have this conversation and we can all change our mindset about prisons.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you for listening.
You're listening to WRUU-LP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are